How many of you have seen Alfred Hitchcock's film Psycho? You know this film? When this was released in Brazil, the Portuguese title was The Boy Who Dresses Like His Mother and Kills. That's the subtitle of my talk. The whole talk is in that subtitle. Why I think storytelling is really important, and we'll go into this in a second, is because I think it's the cultural operating system. How we operate as a culture, our norms and our values are carried by story. Think of the role of the Bible in terms of the kind of ethical systems that we have. Stories carry knowledge from generation to generation, and whoever controls stories controls, in a certain sense, our culture. So with issues of governance, story is incredibly important. We don't notice it. We grow up through it. The first thing you do when you have children is tell them stories, and those stories always have values. I think it's one of the most insidious, one of the most pervasive forms of cultural organization that we have. In the literature on Internet of Things, story, if you look up narrative or story and IoT, what you get 100% is how to sell IoT, what's the story of IoT. But what you don't get is how Internet of Things can actually be used to tell stories. And that's starting to happen. We're seeing quite a bit of it in our labs at MIT and at festivals like IDFA, the Doc Lab at International Documentary Festival Amsterdam. So I just want to try to pull some thoughts together on that space. Okay. Whoops. Giving away the story here. So, Internet of Things, right? We think of things. And things, in fact, can tell stories. And actually, right now in the lobby here is an exhibit called Hey Honey. And it's a bunch of kitchen objects that speak with one another. And it's a really good example of how the Internet of Things really can be things. And speaking of things, I have to just jump out 1 second. And Paul, I'm sorry, I meant to thank you for this invitation. So apologies. I'm really grateful. Paul, I've known Paul a long time, Paul Rutte a long time. And we've had really interesting talks over the long termine. And it's wonderful to actually come together this way. So sorry for that excursus, but thank you. So yeah, it's things. But of course, when you look at the literature on IoT, the first thing you see is it's not things, it's data. This is data that's being transferred between things. In other words, this is not about computer to computer. This is about thing to thing, but through data. And of course, data can tell really wonderful stories. This is a project called Trash Track. That there's a chip embedded in garbage, and you can see a story of inefficiency, a story of waste, a story of a lot of expended energy for nothing. So things can tell stories, and they tell stories through the data trails that they leave behind. But in fact, if you think about what the Internet of Things, how it really works, I think Norbert Wiener's work comes to mind, and his work on cybernetics, because in fact, it's not just the transmission of data, it's actually the little feedback loops that make that data, that give that data sense, that give that data control. As data is produced, it has to cycle back through, and that is where control happens. So cybernetics actually becomes a very important lens, and I think an underappreciated lens to think about IoT. But of course, today we're here to talk about who's in charge. And what I want to argue is that IoT is really a new form of governance. It's a way in which we're regulating behaviors, regulating information, regulating economies, regulating labor flows. Again, this is, I think, important language to use when thinking about Internet of Things, governance. When I was pitching different ideas to Paul, one of my ideas was to talk about the different relations of governance, of IoT to governance in the real world. If you think of a culture like China, the governance of IoT and the governance of the government, of the political economy, they're identical, they're the same. In the United States, the other extreme, there's a lot of tension between them. Your Fitbit is going to generate information that will say something about your health, but in the US context, that can be a disaster. Your insurance company cuts you off, you have no health possibilities if they know you have a problem. The two systems totally don't work. And in Europe, they work, I think, there's hope. I think hope is here. Anyway, you can see here that there's data, there's things, there's cybernetic feedback loops, and of course, it's all about the governance of a cooling system, in this case, in a car. So I want to just say a few broad words about why this relates to story, what's happening in the world that makes changing story forms relevant. We all know we've gone from a culture that was pretty much based on either one-to-one communication, like the telephone, or mostly one-to-many communication, the newspaper, the radio, television, film. And in the last, say, 20, 25 years, we've gone to a many-to-many system. So we have all three of these systems, but the many-to-many has been a game changer. And we've seen a whole new ecosystem arise, platform culture, you could say, to go to the platform here. And this has changed the way we produce culture and consume culture. And one example of this, it's an economic example, but it's somehow in capitalist cultures, these kinds of economic insights tell the truth, or a truth. In 2014, the two giants of our new media economies, Zuckerberg and Bezos, each had a transaction. The Washington Post in the US is probably, next to the New York Times, the best content, the best journalistic content. And Bezos was able to buy it for $250 million, and in fact, that $250 million included television stations and an educational service called Kaplan. In fact, the newspaper was only worth $60 million. Well, $60 million is a lot of money. But Zuckerberg, that same year, bought WhatsApp for $19 billion. And that blue stripe, to me, it's all a lot of money, but I hadn't realized quite how little 250 million was till I saw this. But this says something. Content, the old idea of one-to-many content, which most of us have been trained to value, does not have much financial value. And WhatsApp, which has zero content and is nothing about relationships and the possibility of interaction, that has huge value. So this says something about a real shift in our cultural value systems. We can see it here too. Now this is television viewing in the US market, I think, the North American market. And you can see how bad it's going for television, for the idea of content that's sent out. And this is a revealing counter-argument. 300 hours of content uploaded each minute on YouTube. So the kids that have stopped watching TV are busy making their own content and sharing their own content. So we're stepping into a very different world if you just look at the big numbers. From a world that accepted content to now a world that's much more interested in sharing content and actually producing content. And I'm not going to bore you with this, but there are 101 reasons we could talk about with this. A shift in demographics. Young people are doing all this new stuff. Older people, maybe not so much. The market is incredibly fragmented. No one has a big share anymore. When I think about the 1990s in the Netherlands, when it was Nederland 1, 2 and 3, and that was it. And then came RTL, then came cable. So tons of reasons to think about these changes. That's not so important for this story. But with this are coming whole new forms of storytelling. And I use these examples from Snapchat, Instagram, WhatsApp, basically because these are all attempts, in this case by documentary makers, not to tell their documentaries in the cinema, not to tell their documentaries on television, but actually to use these platforms that younger people go to as ways of telling stories. And what all of these platforms have in common is that they're regulated by algorithms. The sequence of the story, what story you see versus what story your friend sees, all of this is determined by algorithmic arrangements. So there's a kind of new logic. This is less about me making a choice about going to Nederland 2 or Nederland 1, and it's more about the system knowing what I want and giving me what I want. Okay. So if the whole environment, if the whole ecosystem for telling stories has changed, what about the stories themselves? What I want to do is talk to you about 3 different kinds of stories, and then we're going to dive into the last one, algorithmic storytellings. And I want to talk about these in terms of what kind of story, what kind of text it produces, what it means for an idea of who's in charge, who the author is, and of course with that comes agency and authority and all these kind of terms. So the story that we grew up on, the story that we know best, is the fixed story. Books, movies. The sequence is fixed, it's fast. If you buy a paperback or you buy the expensive leather-bound edition of whatever book, it's the same. The sequence of the words is identical. If you watch the video or if you watch the film or if you watch the DVD or this, whatever, it's the very same sequence of shots in Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho. So what's important about these kind of narratives, and there I say it again, here you can see something that's about the transmission of the same knowledge to as many people as possible. And this is where story as a cultural operating system is so important. If everyone, let's say in a Judeo-Christian culture, if everyone grows up reading the same, having the same Bible, we share a lot of values. And that's when you think of the problems of immigration and the problem, the so-called problem of Islam. Why is it a problem? The issue is it's a different cultural operating system. The Quran is not the same. There's a lot of similarity. These are both, Abraham-based religions, but there are differences. And you can sort of see there where there's some tension between the operating systems. So this really matters in terms of what holds cultures together. Maybe it's time for a new cultural operating system. We could maybe make that argument. What's really interesting about this particular story, this particular idea of fixed texts, is that the birthplace is the birthplace of the modern. It's the 15th century. In the 15th century, 2 really important things are invented. One is the book, the printing press by Gutenberg. Although if you're from Harlem, you probably have another story. And one is 3-point perspective. In other words, when you look at a photo or a painting and you recognize the world as if it's from your eyes, that technique, it's a technique, it's not real, it's a technique. We've been trained to see that way. Those are, interestingly, within about 30 years of one another. And both of these are technologies that amplify the self, the way I see everyone else can see, because they'll see the same photo or they'll see the same painting. What I have to say in my book, and I make 20,000 copies of it, anyone who reads that book can see what I see or hear what I think. So this is a really interesting point in our culture where the way we represent is fixed, stabilized, and all of us understand it. It makes perfect sense. Okay, so we all know that story. I won't bore you with more. The experience story is a little bit trickier. And typically when you learn about story in school, this is not what they talk about, but it's really important. Here, story has a different function. It's not carrying a cultural operating system, rather it's about a way of making sense. If you think of marketing, marketers use this idea of story a lot. It's a way of sense making, it's a way of generating memory. And the idea here is that narrative is not so much a text. It's not so much the same path that everyone walks. Narrative is actually an environment. And each of us finds different stories in that environment. So you could use the way hunters work as a good example of this. A hunter enters the world and sees some footprints and sees some fur in the trees and sees some droppings from the animal. And the hunter says, it's a female, it's an older animal, and it's headed towards the water, and I'm going to catch it. I walk through that same space, and I look at the flowers or the trees. I don't see this at all. Depending on your skill level, you'll see something quite different. This idea is developed by an Italian cultural critic, Carlo Ginzburg. He calls it the fanatic tradition, the tradition of hunting. And he says, this actually is the birthplace of story. Story is born by hunters who spend their day wandering around, and at the end of the run, they've got a great story to tell. Or maybe a sad story, I don't know. But this is a really interesting idea because actually, we've celebrated this in our lives. You could go back to the ancient Greeks and talk about memory palaces where you construct a space and you load that space with information, and it's a way to remember things instantly. How the Greeks could remember these long stories, how Homer could remember the Odyssey, that really long text, is by building a space mentally and wandering through it. How do we remember? We do it through rhyme, so poetry is a way to remember. We do it through alphabetical sequence. But you have to go from start to finish on those. They're very linear. This is very open and spatial. You can go left or you can go right. You can pull the memory that you need. Well, this is a long tradition in the West, and you can look at a cathedral and say, how does a cathedral work? Every architectural element there is a reminder, a trigger to tell you the story of Christ. The Trinity, everything's in threes, the church is oriented towards Jerusalem, it's laid out like a cross. Everything about that is a little memory trigger to sort of help you discover a story. Interestingly, it turns out this is the way our brain works. This work was done, the Nobel Prize in 2014, so what's that, 5 years ago, basically takes this old Greek method of the memory palace and says the way we work in space, the way humans orient in space, is that we have a grid. We have a grid in our brain, and we load that grid with events. And if I go to a new space, like I came to Rotterdam yesterday, and already I can feel my grid being there's new markers in it. And I know that this is next to that, and that connects to something else. So this system, actually, of a spatial location through which I can navigate and find different paths, turns out to be physiologically the way that we work. Well, people like Disney knew that a long time ago, right? The way something like Disney World works is that there's a lot of stuff there, but just like a hunter, you can go left, you can go right, many people go there and they all leave with different stories. And so this is kind of an interesting space because, of course, we have lots of examples of it. Live action role-playing games, for example, where basically you've got a character and you've got a few rules and who knows how it's going to go. It's just an open narrative system. Games, we know something like Grand Theft Auto. You can play by what they want you to do, or you can do something totally different. You can just explore the city. Whatever, but it's still a narrative form. Choose your own adventure games. Classic branch narrative, you can go left, right, or in between. These are structured. I'm not saying there's no authorship. I'm saying the author is an environmental architect. And by designing a space, we can find our own stories. In fact, there was just, does Black Mirror show over here? Have anyone seen this episode? So this is exactly a branch narrative, except the interface is a remote control device, and you decide what happens next in each scene. So these are all examples of experience-based stories. What you do results in the story. So think about it. When you read a book, a fixed book like Harry Potter, you don't know what's going to happen on the next page. You only are there for the ride. And it's exactly like walking through one of these. You don't know what's going to happen next. Only at the end do you have a story to tell. In one case, it's a one-size-fits-all story. That's the cultural operating system. In the other case, it's your story. And that's why this is hard to talk about. Your story is hard to talk to everyone about. You understand it. It's good to help you make meaning, but it's a very hard thing to communicate to others. Virtual reality is a really good example of a kind of emerging problem. A lot of film and video makers have moved into VR, and they're trying to tell a story. The problem is, in VR, you can look up, behind, you can look anywhere. VR is actually a great medium for story finding. It's a space where you can plant story elements, but if you try to tell a story, The dilemma is always, how do you get the audience to look where you want them to look? You're abusing, you've got 360 world to be immersed in, and you're trying to tell someone, only look here. People do it all the time, but it's maybe not the best use of this medium. Maybe we have to embrace this notion of experiential storytelling to make better use of this medium. This is also a medium, like games, where there are increasing amounts of artificial intelligence at work, helping guide you through the world. But we'll talk about that in a sec. The main difference I want to make here is that a fixed story, like Shakespeare or whatever, is kind of like taking a tour bus through a city. Everyone's on the same bus. Everyone gets the same story. It's a good story, hopefully. It's an informed story. And we drive in a linear way through the city, and we have a nice story to tell. But wandering is also a way to tell stories. When you wander, you do what you want to do. You only have, it's your story, it's your personal story. You can share it, but it's equally valuable. Together, they're really wonderful, because together you have a good overview and you have your own story. So I'm not trying to say kill off the fixed story and only have experiential. Together they work well. But this kind of storytelling we need to celebrate and think about, because it's really what our new media industries are doing. Okay. Now we're going to go into the algorithmic story. And basically, I want to talk about like how we navigate these stories, what the techniques are. And there are two approaches. One is historical, like historical data, what Google does to you every day, like, oh, this is what you look at and we're going to give you more. And the other is real-time data capture. And those systems are coming on stream fast, and they're kind of both interesting or creepy, or it depends how you want to see it. And basically what this is that this is an experiential story. It's an environment, it's a landscape, but you don't have to make any decisions. The decisions are made for you. So it feels like a fixed story, but in fact it's an experiential story, but the pathing is done by the AI. So this is a lot of blah blah, but I want to say one thing. These are, I use the word recursive, so something that falls back on itself. These are stories that kind of look at you and rightly or wrongly come to some assumptions and use that knowledge to generate the story. So they're recursive. As I already said, they combined like the fixed story and the experiential story. They feel stable. It feels like, oh, that's the story. But in fact, everyone might see quite a different story. And the real issue here, and that we have to think about, is who's in charge? The theme of the conference, who's in charge? And especially with issues like bias, and I'll show you some, this can be very, very tricky area. Just to say, this area is moving really quickly. So this just shows I guess in dollars, it doesn't really say, but it doesn't matter in terms of like money. In terms of money, you can see that there is quite dramatic growth just in the past few years. So actually the investment levels in VR were quite strong, and I would say 2 or 3 years ago they started to drop. And right at that same point, AI has taken over. And this is going to the biggest investment areas, and they're there, deep learning, natural language processing. These are exactly the areas that work with storytelling. So what I'm going to say is kind of new stuff, but you can expect it in a couple of years, it's going to be moving fast. And it's also going to be moving fast because of Moore's Law. And Moore's Law, what you probably know, is about the doubling of processing capacity about every 2 years. Now, when you think of double, that's exponential. This is an exponential growth chart. We keep being told Moore's Law, well, it can't go anymore. It's too much. It's why our phones are way more powerful than the computers that went when the man first went to the moon. Your phone is like super, like I don't know how many times more powerful than those computers. It still continues to operate, this law. So combine the investment in money with the continuous growth of processing capacity, and the conditions are there for something really dramatic. We're starting to see in mainstream journals, this is from the Atlantic, people sort of playing around with algorithms. Algorithm help me write this story, or Der Spiegel is, really trying to play with the algorithms. And, we know this. We know from Facebook. We know this is a big growth area, Google. So let's look at where the data comes from, and then we'll look at some story examples. So Google is a great example of data that comes from your history. It knows immediately. I opened this, I made this capture here, but it gave it to me in English. So even though it's Nederlands or Frisian, it knows I'm in the Netherlands, and I may want those language choices, but it offered me first English because it knows I work in English. That kind of data tracking is really interesting, and we know all about that. But basically, it's to say there's a big store of data on each of us that could be already used to figure out what genre you might like, whether you like happy endings or sad endings, whether you like adventure or kind of chill narratives. So that kind of data can obviously be used to steer. It's already used to steer your Facebook feed. We know with Spotify, so this is the company that does the taste prediction for Spotify, Pandora, countless other companies. It's like my next door neighbor in Boston. It's a little company from some MIT kids started called Echo Nest. And Echo Nest does the taste predictors, and they basically do two things. For music, they try to figure out, so do you like a certain tempo? Do you like a certain kind of instrumentation? Do you like vocals? What genre? All those kind of characteristics on the one hand, and they combine that with people like you. So people like you also like, and they put those two data sets together, and their predictions aren't bad. Amazon uses the same kind of system to predict your book use. So we have pretty fast evolving taste predictors. So this is one building block. If you're gonna tell stories with algorithms, if you're gonna let the algorithm path you through a system, it needs to know what you like. And these are pretty good indicators that we're getting good at that. We're getting good at taste prediction. Another system that's being used right now, and I'll show you an example of this later on, is, so we know about facial recognition. This is emotion recognition. So this is tracking your face. Marketers use this a lot. You know that little camera on your computer? So if you're watching ads, you never know I keep my little thing covered. You never know what data is being tracked. But this is basically used by marketers a lot to see how people respond to advertisements. And they're good. These are good at micro expressions. So are you, a moment of disgust followed by 3 moments of happiness? Who knows? But this data can be really good at being a steering mechanism through a narrative. I don't know how many of you are from media industries or advertising or marketing. Anyone from those worlds? Because a lot of in those sectors, often it's important to keep people on the site, to keep people on the text. You're paid by how long people stay on. As soon as someone starts to get bored, you know it, and you could conceivably change the narrative right there. That's how this is being used. This is a technique called foveated rendering. So the main reason for this, right now in virtual reality, you've got to build a world, and you want it to be high definition. That's a lot of data to build, above you, below you, next to you, behind you. All of that in high def takes a lot of computer power. It's why most VR is, good VR is sort of stuck together with computers. It's a lot of processing needed. Foveated rendering solves that by only making high resolution where you look, literally where you look. And it can do this as fast as your eye can move. So this is a pretty interesting technique. And there's a lot of, this would be like Google Cardboard 360. This would be like Oculus and HTC Vive. This is the new stuff that uses foveated rendering. But foveated rendering solves an interesting technical problem, but it watches what you watch. And that's interesting data for some people. So even though the reason is to sort of lower the processing demands in building a world, the other really interesting use is, I see that you're looking at the shoes. And the red shoes you can tell your pulse through your pupil. The red shoes make your heart beat faster. Like, we know what to market to you. So this becomes a really interesting steering device. This can be used as a navigational system. I know which character you're looking a lot, like in the Black Mirror episode. Right now you have to click. But what if we used eye trackers? What if your camera was watching your eye? Then I would know, oh, you're looking at this character a lot. That's the story we're going to give you, not the other character, but the one you're watching. Or we see that, like, we know that you like adventure, so we're going to give you the thing that makes your heart beat faster. Or we know you're getting bored, time to juice it up. And so these are really quite potentially powerful technologies. This is another one that sort of has far more nuance than I had imagined, EEG trackers. So right now in China, this is an ad for a Chinese company, SmartCap. Has those little dots in there are EEG trackers. And these things are pretty nuanced in terms of what kind of brain waves they can track. So you can, like that facial thing I showed you, hate or happiness or lust or whatever, those things you can pretty much steer them pretty easily. So this can be a really interesting steering mechanism. All to say, another one, anything that puts out a metric, anything, and this is where the IoT comes, all these devices, all these things in the world can be used to communicate to one another, but they can also be used to build stories. Okay, I gotta keep this moving here. So let's look at what's happening in the world of story. There are some good examples already out there. Probably a couple of low millions, 2 or 3 million per year stories are being written in newspapers and things like BuzzFeed by computers. Anything with structured data, for example, sports or finance, like sports, a football match. There's a time markers and there's events that occur. Those can be instantly, just with the press of a button, be turned into a story. And not just a story, but you can define it by, I want to tell the story from the goalkeeper's perspective. I want to tell the story from the whatever position you want. Click of a button and it happens. And you cannot tell these are not written by humans. So these companies, Narrative Science and EasyOp, whatever, their business is having algorithms tell stories, no human intervention. The BBC is using this, and you can see they are journalistic, they're responsible, they have a human check it by the end. But the graphics, the whole package is just put together by a machine. It takes the data, it sucks out the data, and storyfies it. And these happen in real time. They happen instantly. Stanford University and Adobe have come up with this editing system that allows you to set certain parameters. So you have all your material you've shot on video, and you say, well, this is going to be an interview. Okay, interview. I want it to look like news interview. Okay, news interview. I want it to favor one character versus the other character. Fine. Press a button and the cut is done instantly. Let's say you're missing a shot. The character didn't say what you want to say. You can map the face, in this case Schwarzenegger's face, you can map the face over an actor, and whatever the actor does is what the original person does. So this is part of the deep fake system, right? And when you can make people basically do anything. The same thing with lip syncing words. Okay, so basically we can synthesize anything. We're getting to the point where we can do it on the fly. We can make a story on demand, synthetically. Prototypes, we all know prototypes. Any of you that are gamers know about non-player characters, right? These are just basically characters that do stuff that is kind of just generated in response to what you're doing. It can be generated in response to what you're doing. These are algorithmically constructed beings that you can't really control, but they're watching you and responding to you. Stephanie Dinkins has a really wonderful piece. These are just some examples of AI-driven stories where things are the interface. She's made a model of her head and puts this in a gallery, and then people come up and say stuff to it, and it listens to what people say, and it learns from what people say, and it turns out people say really horrible things. And so she starts to repeat really horrible things. Gabriel 2052 is a woman who I guess, had a bad relationship, so she loaded up the ideal boyfriend into this robot, and he says all the right things all the time. He knows what her mood is. He senses her emotional state and says the perfect thing at the perfect time. Has a loaded full of memories. It's a wonderful. So, okay. This is actually, if you step out in the lobby, you'll see a piece by Classine. It's the Hey Honey, which is a bunch of kitchen, it's right out here, a bunch of kitchen items that are talking to one another, no human needed. In this case, this is a piece they had at IDFA. It won the prize for interactive. And it's basically humans and things interacting through Google, and you're getting instructions from the Google system. Got to zip along here, almost near the end. This is a VR piece called Notes on Blindness. It's a beautiful piece, but the interesting thing, and it's not really said much, if you put this headset on and you just kind of sit there, the story goes pretty quickly. But if you put the headset on and you look around and you're interested in the world, it takes much longer. The AI system is watching how you interact, and if you're interacting with the space, you get a lot more time to do it. So it's very subtle. So these are all examples of fairly subtle but still in the world things. Another kind of VR application right now is virtual beings. So these are characters. Let's say you're not watching the character, you're looking somewhere else. In Wolves in the Walls, a little girl will run in front of you and say, hey, why aren't you paying attention to me? What's wrong? And so ignore her, and you look somewhere else, and she'll run in front again. Do you want me to cry? Should I cry to get your attention? Or do you want me to be happy? And based on how your head moves, she'll go through different things to keep your attention on her. This is a purely synthetic being that is being generated in response to the sensors on the headset. Karen Palmer's Riot basically watches your face, and depending on how your face reacts while you're watching this documentary about a riot, you'll get more violence or less violence. When you go into this, you say, I like it violent. Okay, you'll get violence. And as you start to grimace, you'll get more violence. It really ramps it up. So all of these things that I'm showing you are connecting things, the data from things, into the architecture, the decisions that are being made to tell stories. An AI piece, I'm not going to go into this. Here's one that's in the works where you sort of do a Sherlock Holmes thing, basically literally giving things information and then letting the Internet of Things take over by following the clues that those things give you. Okay, wrap it up here. Governance. That's what we're all here for to talk about today. Who has access to these technologies? The irony of this picture, this is a new initiative from Stanford University, human-centered artificial intelligence. And look at those, in America anyway, it's a fairly diverse culture. We have 13% black and 17% Hispanic. And this is, how many, this is not the full board. There are more people, and there are some people from India and from some Asians, but it's kind of not representative. For something that's all about human-centered. There's only certain humans that are represented, in fact. Who has agency? If you think of facial recognition systems, predictive policing, where the algorithm tells the police to go somewhere because there's a problem. Soap dispensers, where you put your hand under, and if it's black skin, soap doesn't come out. Can't read your skin. This is amazing. 68% success rate on darker female faces, as opposed to 100%. This is simply about what data set they use to build these systems. What's their testing set? And it's white males. I'm a white male. I have nothing against white males. But this is a problem when you're trying to do something for society. So when you think about a future storytelling system that's based on our reactions, who our is starts to become pretty important. Ethics are really quite important too, and this is bizarre. Look at the date, April 4th. April 4th, last week. Google's ethics board for their artificial intelligence existed for 1 week and they shut it down. And they shut it down because they put these crazy people on the board and there was a lot of complaining. But if Google can't even figure out how to organize a board, what the heck are they doing with ethics in general in AI? This is really concerning. Because these are powerful systems, they're fast morphing systems, and what are we? Are we a training set for the algorithm? Are we data to be sold, bought and sold? And the answer, alas, is yes and yes. So something, again, something I know to think about a lot. So I think because the stakes here, and this is where I'm going to stop, because the stakes are, this is our cultural operating system. This is our way of sense-making in the world. As we move to these new technologies, as experiential narratives become pathed for us, who is doing the pathing is really important. Who's in charge matters. And we can see with these systems that they're not totally without problems. So yeah, you can be dystopian or utopian, you can be Hobbes or Locke, you can see the world through the eyes of Mark Zuckerberg or Elon Musk. These can be a great thing for us or it can be a scary thing. That's for us to determine. I mean, I really feel strongly about human agency. So with that, I will stop and thank you very much for your attention.